When we try to understand the medieval village, the first thing we must do is clear away a long tradition of romantic ideas. For more than a century, the word village has been wrapped in comforting images shaped by art, tourism, and popular storytelling. We imagine quiet lanes, humble cottages clustered around a church, and a close-knit community living in harmony. This image says more about modern longing than about medieval reality. As cities expanded and industrial life took hold, people began to look back at the countryside as a symbol of simplicity, innocence, and shared values. In recent decades, historians have worked hard to strip away these comforting myths. This effort is necessary, but it has sometimes gone too far. Some have begun to question whether the village ever functioned as a real community at all. According to this view, individual ambition mattered more than collective life, and rural organization was driven mainly by powerful landowners rather than by villagers themselves. These arguments emerged as a reaction against earlier, overly sentimental interpretations. Yet, when we look carefully at the evidence, the village still emerges as a meaningful social unit, even if it does not fit modern expectations. One of the main challenges is that villages left behind very few records of their own. Most surviving documents were produced by landowners, royal officials, or church authorities. As a result, we usually see village life through the eyes of outsiders whose experiences were very different from those of ordinary villagers. Some believe these records closely reflect daily rural life, but this assumption ignores their built-in bias. To understand the village from within, we must read these sources carefully and critically, always aware of whose voice we are hearing. The power of landowners also needs to be seen in context. Lords enjoyed comfort and status because they drew wealth from the labor of others, and their main concern was securing rents and services. This gave them influence over many aspects of rural life, including farming practices, local trade, and family matters. Yet this influence had clear limits. Medieval authority was inefficient and fragmented, and no single power could fully control everyday village life. Rule was irregular, uneven, and often resisted. Social attitudes within the ruling class also reduced direct control. The elite valued warfare, religion, hunting, and courtly life far more than estate management. Running landholdings was seen as dull and was usually delegated to others. Large estates were often leased out, and even when landowners became more involved in agriculture, they relied heavily on professional managers. Many never visited some of their own lands at all. Smaller landowners lived closer to their estates, but even they were frequently absent due to military or administrative duties. At every level, the ruling class lacked both the desire and the capacity to dominate village life completely. The greatest limitation on landlord power was the absence of a permanent administrative force. Without full-time officials or policing, control depended on local participation. Villagers themselves were required to serve as overseers, collectors, and representatives. Local courts were guided by officials connected to the landowner, but most of the practical roles were filled by villagers. This system was cheap, efficient, and relied on local knowledge. Orders were more likely to be accepted when they came from familiar figures within the community. This arrangement also had consequences. By involving village leaders, landowners had to share a measure of authority and tolerate local self-interest. Village representatives softened the harsh edges of exploitation, making the system workable rather than purely oppressive. Through this interaction, the administration of the estate and the life of the village became closely intertwined. When we look at the village on its own terms, we find that it was less a physical place than an administrative unit. The same word could describe tightly packed settlements or scattered farms. What mattered was not layout, but function. The village acted as the smallest unit of local organization. It was responsible for taxes, public works, defense duties, law enforcement, and collective obligations to higher authorities. Much of this activity left no written trace. Decisions were discussed orally, responsibilities were divided locally, and representatives were chosen without paperwork. Even so, the system worked. Slowly and sometimes reluctantly, villages met their obligations. Payments were made, soldiers were sent, and infrastructure was maintained. The clearest evidence of village self-government appears in the management of shared land. Rules were created to protect harvests, control grazing, and regulate animals. These rules were enforced locally, sometimes with the involvement of higher authorities, but their purpose was clear. They safeguarded the survival of the community. As we look more closely at village rules and everyday regulations, it becomes clear that many of them passed through the authority of the Lord's court. From this angle, it can seem as if landowners were the driving force behind local rules and the organization of farmland. Yet this picture is incomplete. A large portion of village regulation simply did not concern the Lord at all. Matters such as arranging a shared herdsman or coordinating everyday agricultural routines were handled locally, without outside pressure. There are also moments when villagers clearly acted on their own initiative. In settlements with multiple landowners, local meetings sometimes took responsibility for organizing fields and managing shared resources. These places were not rare. In fact, villages tied to more than one authority were common, which suggests that such gatherings were part of normal village life. Even where a single estate included several villages, each settlement still met independently to make its own decisions. This shows that village organization did not disappear beneath external control. Managing farmland was the central task of village life, but it was far from the only one. Villagers worked together to raise lump payments demanded from outside authorities, handled shared expenses, and sometimes acted collectively to protect common land. In some places, entire villages even took over the management of land that would normally have belonged to the Lord. These arrangements brought some communities closer than any others to full local self-rule. Villagers were also deeply involved in maintaining order and enforcing shared standards of behavior. This happened partly through cooperation with formal courts and church authority, but also through informal community actions. Public shaming rituals and noisy protests against unacceptable behavior played a role in keeping social balance. These practices were not random acts of cruelty. They were methods used by communities to defend shared expectations and boundaries. Over time, the village became increasingly connected to church life. Local representatives took responsibility for maintaining sacred spaces and organizing fundraising events that doubled as social gatherings. Most contributions were secured through social pressure rather than force, but when persuasion failed, village leaders sometimes used formal authority to compel participation. This shows how closely local governance, religion, and community life were woven together. The church also absorbed and reshaped older customs that were not originally religious. Seasonal processions and farming celebrations carried practical and symbolic meaning that went beyond faith. Although these traditions are poorly recorded, scattered references confirm that festive gatherings and ritual performances were part of village life. Occasionally, these events crossed boundaries and provoked conflict, especially when social roles were temporarily reversed. Such moments reveal tensions beneath the surface, particularly in periods when elites were less tolerant of challenge or humor from below. All of this points to a village that existed as a real organization. It governed land and people in ways that served both internal needs and external demands. Alongside formal duties, villagers also came together in shared actions shaped by custom, celebration, and discipline. The challenge lies in understanding how collective decisions were actually made. Earlier interpretations assumed widespread harmony and shared purpose, but the evidence does not support this idealized view. When village rules claim to reflect universal agreement, we should be cautious. In reality, some voices carried more weight than others. Decisions were usually shaped by respected and experienced men who regularly held local positions of responsibility. This group was not tiny, but it did form a loose leadership layer within village society. These leaders were often better off than their neighbors, but the gap between wealthier and poorer villagers was not extreme. Landholdings were generally modest, and economic differences did not create sharply divided social camps. Because of this, village leaders rarely formed a separate class with interests completely opposed to the rest of the community. Conflicts did arise, but they followed many lines. Sometimes villages acted collectively against external authority, organizing legal challenges and pooling resources to defend shared rights. In these cases, local leadership was turned outward, resisting rather than enforcing control. At other times, villagers clashed among themselves. Some cooperated with authority, while others resisted it. Loyalty to landowners could run deep, especially in times of wider political conflict, when villagers sometimes joined elite causes in large numbers. Economic tensions existed as well. Many households relied on seasonal work or service to supplement their income, while others needed hired labor to manage their land. Village rules sometimes favored those who employed workers, revealing unequal influence in local decision-making. Yet these divisions were softened by family ties and life stages. Young workers often became independent householders later in life, and poorer villagers were frequently relatives of wealthier ones. Everyday life involved constant exchange. Tools, animals, labor, and assistance were borrowed and shared across households. Economic boundaries were blurred, and village survival depended on cooperation as much as competition. Research into village disputes shows that social contact varied widely. Poorer villagers tended to have fewer connections, while wealthier ones appeared frequently in roles that involved guaranteeing others' behavior. Violence was not confined to any one group. Fights broke out across social lines, including among leading families. There is little evidence of a permanent split between rich and poor. Village life was not peaceful. Disagreements were frequent, and violence was common. Minor assaults were routine, and serious crimes occurred more often than we might expect. Yet, even in these cases, communities often stepped in to restore order. Disputes that began as personal conflicts could be resolved through collective pressure and formal guarantees of good behavior. In later centuries, some tensions became harder to manage. As farming practices shifted and individuals sought to expand their operations, shared systems came under strain. A few villagers refused to accept communal rules, leading to prolonged conflict. These problems increased as larger farmers emerged, whose interests no longer aligned easily with cooperative systems. Despite these pressures, the village remained a living and functioning community well into the early modern period. Predictions of its collapse were exaggerated. While some settlements declined, Most continued to operate, adapting to change rather than disappearing. Over time, village organization evolved. New local roles appeared, and administrative structures became more complex. Even so, the core idea of the village as a self-regulating community endured. Looking further back, we can see that villages did not suddenly appear fully formed. They developed gradually alongside farming systems and growing pressure on land. In open landscapes, village boundaries emerged earlier. In wooded and upland areas, they took much longer to define. To understand how rural settlement changed over time, we have to balance big ideas with close local detail. One powerful story has shaped the way we talk about late medieval England for a long time. It says that as conditions worsened, people pulled back from difficult land, cultivation shrank, and many settlements faded or disappeared. This explanation sounds logical because it ties settlement to population. When numbers rise, people push into new ground. When numbers fall, the least productive areas are the first to be abandoned. The usual timeline behind this story runs like this. Population grew strongly from the late 11th century to around the turn of the 14th century. As more mouths needed food, farming expanded and intensified. Land that had once seemed too wet, too steep, too stony, or too heavily wooded was brought into use. Hillsides were plowed, marshy edges were drained, and woodland was cleared. By about 1300, much of this newly exploited land produced disappointing harvests, especially for grain. When yields were weak and pressure on resources was high, hardship followed. Then disease and repeated epidemics accelerated the crisis, and the countryside entered a long period of contraction. In that classic telling, the withdrawal from the harder edge of agriculture was not just a symptom. It became the spark that set off wider breakdown. At first glance, a lot of evidence seems to support this view. Across many regions, traces of medieval farming appear in places that later became pasture or rough land. We can see patterns of settlement expanding and retreating again and again over the very long term. In many periods, people concentrated in better valleys and richer soils, then spread outward when numbers and demand rose, and finally fell back when conditions changed. For the early medieval centuries, settlement signals often cluster in areas suited to reliable agriculture, suggesting that communities repeatedly returned to good ground. We also find examples that match the classic retreat story in a very direct way. In some upland zones, large-scale cultivation appears relatively late, then fades quickly. There are places where cereal farming seems to surge in the early 13th century and then withdraw within 100 years, leaving the higher ground to grazing. In other regions, records point to grain being grown at surprisingly high altitudes and then declining before the mid-14th century. In still other areas, small settlements appear to rise in the 13th century and then shrink or vanish in the next. The documents often strengthen this impression. In newly expanded zones, farming frequently leaned toward hardier, lower-value grains that could tolerate poorer ground. Estate accounts and local testimony from the early 14th century increasingly describe land as thin, infertile, sandy, stony, or simply not worth the effort. Managers sometimes decided it was better to rent out such land rather than keep it under direct control, effectively shifting the risk onto tenants. In wet lowlands, drainage systems sometimes struggled to hold back flooding by the early 14th century, and in some districts, the battle was already being lost. From this angle, the logic of expansion and retreat seems almost unavoidable. Yet, when we look more closely, the picture becomes less tidy. The first problem is that difficult land is not easy to define. Much of lowland England can grow crops under the right conditions. Soil quality depends on many factors, and what looks poor to a modern observer may not have been poor under medieval methods. Heavy clay, for example, can be challenging for modern machinery, yet medieval teams and tools could sometimes work it effectively. Land can also change over centuries. Some moorlands may have become worse through later misuse, and downland that looks thin today may once have been more workable. Climate also matters. A small shift in temperature or rainfall can turn marginal grain growing into a losing gamble, pushing communities toward grazing instead. And we have to remember that people farming mainly for household survival may have judged land differently from managers focused on labor costs and market return. Difficult land is always a relative label, not a fixed category. A second complication is timing. If the classic model were always true, we would expect the worst land to be settled last. Yet archaeology shows that people sometimes farmed in harsh environments surprisingly early. High upland sites and sandy heaths could be occupied in the early medieval centuries, sometimes long before the major population boom of the High Middle Ages. It is hard to believe that early settlers were forced into bleak ground simply because better land was unavailable. In many cases, choices must have been shaped by local opportunity, political control, resources like grazing or timber, or patterns of movement and security, not just soil quality. Even in wooded districts where later clearing is well known, settlement history can be uneven in puzzling ways. One area might show strong early occupation and farming, while nearby land of similar character remains lightly used until much later. Some woodland that was cleared in the High Middle Ages may not have been untouched forest at all. In certain places, trees may have reclaimed older fields after the end of Roman rule, so later clearance was less a first conquest than a return. This leads to a third challenge, and it strikes at the heart of the retreat idea. If withdrawal from difficult land drove late medieval desertion, the settlements that vanished should mostly sit on late-developed, lower-quality ground. In some parts of Europe, that seems to happen. In England, however, many deserted villages are found in the open farming districts, not on the supposed fringe. These villages may have taken their final concentrated form relatively late, but the land around them often had a very long history of cultivation, reaching back into prehistory and the Roman period. Some places show clear weakness even before the first great epidemic wave, and disease may only have delivered the final blow. But these were not new outposts carved from wilderness. They were communities rooted in old farmland. Abandonment did occur in uplands and wooded regions too, and sometimes it affected small settlements rather than whole villages. This matters because the disappearance of a major village is dramatic and visible. The loss of scattered farms and hamlets creates a patchwork effect that is easier to miss, both in documents and in later interpretation. We still cannot measure this fully without more local work, but the samples we have suggest an important point. The number of households affected by late medieval settlement loss may have been heavier in the major open field villages than in many dispersed districts. Even where dispersed settlements declined, not all of them were late foundations. Some stood near land cultivated for centuries with little or no interruption. Meanwhile, a surprising number of settlements founded in the Great Expansion centuries survived into modern times, both in woodland belts and in hilly regions. In other words, withdrawal did not consistently target only the newest or weakest ground. It often struck long-established farming landscapes as well. There is one more twist. In some places, new small homes appeared even in the 15th century, especially on unused land at the edges of settlement. This does not fit a simple story of steady retreat. Instead, it suggests a more complex reshaping, where some communities contracted, some shifted focus, and some forms of settlement adapted rather than disappeared. To explain why settlements form, grow, weaken, or vanish, we have to look beyond a single cause. People in the past made choices, and those choices were driven by many motives. Some were practical, some were emotional, and some were shaped by belief, status, or power. If we reduce settlement history to simple profit and loss, we miss a large part of the story. Religious ambition is one example. Certain monastic communities deliberately searched for isolated places because hardship itself carried meaning. They wanted distance from ordinary society, and they sometimes accepted poor ground or difficult access for the sake of discipline and identity. Even so, if a chosen site proved impossible to live in, they could relocate. The point is that settlement decisions were not always made to maximize comfort or harvest. Law and privilege could shape the landscape in equally non-economic ways. Royal forest rules created tension between officials and local inhabitants. People were fined for hunting deer or clearing woodland, and enforcement could irritate and disrupt daily life. Yet it did not stop clearing altogether. What it did do, in certain zones, was slow it down or redirect it. Woodland sometimes remained intact near royal hunting centers, not because it was useless, but because it served a different purpose. Elite fashion and display added another layer. Aristocratic parks spread widely in the 13th and 14th centuries, and many existed less to make money than to project status and provide pleasure. The land inside these parks was often perfectly workable farmland. We can see that some of it had been cultivated before the park was enclosed, and in a few cases parts were plowed again later. Parks could even attract settlement when lords moved residences or built new centers within them. For reasons of identity, prestige, and leisure, powerful people sometimes kept good land out of production or encouraged settlement in places that made little sense from a purely farming perspective. Ordinary villagers also made choices, though their freedom was limited by local authority, community pressure, and their own resources. Still, different legal arrangements could affect how long people held on in hard times. In many cases, newly cleared land came with lighter burdens, while older holdings carried heavier payments and more obligations. That difference mattered. If one plot demanded more dues year after year, while another required less, households had strong reasons to protect the lighter burdened land, even if harvests were not ideal. The structure of obligations could make weaker land feel more valuable than it looked on the surface. Markets could transform the value of poor soils. A place with difficult ground could survive and even prosper if it enjoyed low charges and easy access to a major buyer. Near a huge city, tenants could sell produce, supply urban demand, and adjust their farming choices. Some villages close to London, for example, were pushed toward market gardening and intensive food production, and their records show fewer signs of collapse than many inland communities around the same time. In such cases, social privilege and market access could outweigh soil limits and keep settlements alive longer than the classic models would predict. But human factors could also damage land that was otherwise good. Some communities on long cultivated ground fell into decline surprisingly early, even before the worst waves of disease. In certain districts, fertility depended on a delicate system that linked grain with livestock. Sheep were essential not only as animals, but as moving fertilizer, enriching fields through manure and careful folding. If flocks shrank or husbandry broke down, yields could fall sharply even on land that had supported farming for centuries. A village could become poor without any change in its soil, simply because the balance of animals, labor, and resources collapsed. Heavy demands, repeated shocks, or animal disease could undermine that balance and turn workable land into a failing asset. All of this reminds us that the English landscape did not operate like a simple frontier that advanced and retreated in a single wave. Clearing woodland was not always a dramatic, edge-of-the-map conquest. It was often small-scale, gradual, and local. In many places, peasants expanded fields piece by piece, taking over parcels that had once been common grazing or rough ground and slowly bringing them into regular use. Landlords might authorize it or benefit from it, but they were not always the main organizers. Often, the most active participants were established tenants who wanted to enlarge a holding or provide land for younger children who could not inherit the main farm. Clearing could create new settlements in some cases, but more often it reshaped a landscape that was already partly occupied. Regional systems mattered as well. Different districts had their own farming structures, settlement patterns, and constraints, and these responded to population and economic change in different ways. Older attempts to explain regional differences through ethnic origins do not hold up. Nor does a tidy stage-by-stage evolution where one region steadily advanced toward a single ideal pattern. Local communities were cautious. They often avoided changes that might increase short-term cropping but weaken long-term survival. Intensifying grain production could reduce grazing, reduce manuring, and ultimately reduce yields. Many communities chose stability over risk. We can see these contrasts clearly by comparing two neighboring zones in the West Midlands. In the open farming districts south of Warwickshire and into southeast Worcestershire, settlements at their peak were mostly compact villages. Their agriculture relied on large open fields and a simple rotation that balanced cropped land with fallow. Pasture and woodland were limited, so fuel and timber often depended on distant connections and trade. Soils were dominated by heavy clay, with lighter ground in river valleys. Fertility depended on the partnership of sheep and grain, and yields sat within the normal medieval range. Many tenants held land under obligations that required regular cash payments, which implies they were selling produce and engaging in markets. Landholding was measured through standard units, commonly divided into halves and quarters, and a typical holding might include a few dozen acres of plowland. This region had been densely occupied for a long time, and by the late 11th century, it was already heavily settled. When population rose in the next 2 centuries, pressure became intense. Villagers tried several ways to cope. Some holdings were divided with the lord's approval, and complete full-size tenancies became less common. Fields were also worked harder. People sometimes planted parts of ground that was meant to rest, trying to squeeze more food out of the same acreage. But there were hard limits. If holdings became too fragmented, everyone would fall below survival level. Rules of inheritance often protected the main holding by keeping it intact for one heir, which left younger children searching for other routes. Some could marry into land, some could buy small plots, but many had no choice but to leave. By the 13th century, rural life was running under intense pressure. Each village had developed a fragile balance between landholding and cultivation. Communities were not only trying to feed themselves, but also to generate enough surplus to meet rents, dues, and taxes demanded from outside. This balance was never stable. In the early 14th century, it was disrupted, likely by a combination of rising demands and weaknesses within the farming system itself. After the middle of the century, disease and movement of people forced villages to adapt to a completely new reality. As population fell, the structure of village society changed. Smallholders became fewer, while a limited number of more prosperous farmers expanded their control over land. Farming methods had to shift. Labor-heavy grain production was gradually replaced by grazing, which required fewer people. Villages that had grown large in order to supply grain for dense populations suddenly found themselves oversized and unnecessary. By the early 15th century, some communities were close to collapse. A reduced number of inhabitants struggled to farm neglected strips overrun by weeds while trying to protect their crops from expanding herds owned by wealthier neighbors. Landowners faced a choice. They could attempt to restore villages by resisting migration and rebuilding abandoned houses, or they could reshape their estates by clearing out the remaining residents and converting farmland into enclosed pasture. Some acted quickly, others waited until villages faded away on their own. By the early 16th century, a significant share of settlements had vanished, and most of the survivors were far smaller than before. Those that endured adopted more flexible farming, mixing reduced grain cultivation with grazing. In woodland districts, the situation was different. Settlements there were more scattered and relied less on large open fields. Land was often held in enclosed plots, and pasture played a central role, supported by wide commons and heaths. Farming combined grain, often hardier crops, with strong emphasis on livestock, especially cattle. Authority from large institutions was weaker, rents were lighter, and many tenants held their land with greater freedom. Although individual holdings were smaller, people were not necessarily poorer because they had access to shared grazing and were involved in crafts and rural industries such as fuel production and metalworking. These landscapes had very deep roots. Evidence of settlement stretches back thousands of years, even though medieval population density was relatively low. Over time, cultivated patches, woodland, marsh, and pasture formed a flexible mosaic rather than a rigid system. In the 12th and 13th centuries, clearing expanded cultivation and enclosure, while growing numbers of markets and small towns provided outlets for livestock, animal products, and crafted goods. Grain shortfalls could be covered through trade with neighboring regions. Population growth could be absorbed without breaking the system. There were moments of tension, including violent resistance to enclosure, and famine hit hard in the early 14th century. Even so, these communities recovered more easily than many grain-focused villages. Later population decline led to abandonment of some settlements and a return of farmland to pasture. But the change was gradual rather than catastrophic. Some woodland regenerated, while other areas shifted entirely to grass. Large-scale meat production developed, often alongside thriving peasant households who benefited from small-scale livestock farming. By the early 16th century, these districts were economically strong enough to shoulder a greater share of taxation than they had centuries earlier. Across Europe, thousands of villages disappeared in the later Middle Ages. This fact is clear, but the reasons behind it remain debated. Explanations differ sharply depending on where we look. On the continent, Abandoned settlements are usually linked to population decline and falling grain prices, both trends that began in the 14th century. In England, however, village desertion is often explained in a different way, as the result of landowners turning farmland into pasture in search of profit after the mid-15th century. This contrast has long stood out. English villages seem to have followed a different path, vanishing later and for different reasons, even though England experienced many of the same economic pressures as the rest of Europe. If we look more closely, this sharp division becomes less convincing. English villages were not abandoned only because of aggressive landowners or sheep farming. Many were already weakened by long-term changes that affected rural society across Europe. Shifts in population, patterns of land use, and the structure of village life all played a role. Enclosure was often a final step, not the original cause. The evidence for late medieval village life is scattered and incomplete. After the mid-14th century, continuous and reliable records are rare, which makes it hard to trace every settlement's fate. One way to overcome this is to study many individual cases from a single region and look for shared patterns. When we do this in the West Midlands, especially in areas such as Gloucestershire, Warwickshire, and Worcestershire, a clear picture begins to emerge. This region contains a striking number of abandoned villages, with especially heavy concentrations in river valleys, clay plains, and upland districts like the Cotswolds. Woodland areas, by contrast, show far fewer cases of total desertion. Focusing on one region has its limits, but the West Midlands is significant in its own right. A large share of England's known deserted villages lies within this area, and in some districts, the losses were extreme. Entire clusters of neighboring settlements vanished, leaving wide stretches of countryside without villages at all. At the same time, the region was not unique. Its landscape and social structure resemble much of central England, where desertion was also common. Total abandonment tells only part of the story. Many villages did not disappear completely, but shrank dramatically. Earthworks, building debris, and pottery scatters reveal places where dozens of houses once stood. Even in areas with scattered settlement, large numbers of individual homes were lost. These smaller-scale contractions are harder to trace and have not been systematically recorded, but they show that depopulation reached far beyond the most famous deserted villages. Late medieval desertion also needs to be placed within a much longer history. Archaeology has revealed many early medieval settlements that were abandoned centuries before the Black Death. Some vanished between the 6th and 10th centuries, while others are known only from early documents and never appear again. These early losses likely reflect a process in which scattered settlements gradually merged into larger, more compact villages. Depopulation, then, was not always a sign of crisis. It could also be a side effect of growth, as people moved toward more favored locations. By the late 11th century, settlement patterns became more stable, and many places recorded at that time survived into the modern era. Even so, some names disappear soon afterward, suggesting that the process of concentration continued for generations. In periods of strong lordly power, villages could also be moved or erased to make way for estates, parks, or monastic land. In a few cases, tenants were displaced or bought out as land was reorganized. These changes affected individual places, but they do not explain the scale of desertion seen later. Most landowners preferred to keep tenants and draw income from them, especially when land was scarce. The main wave of village desertion began in the early 14th century and continued well into the 15th. Around 1300, the rural economy reached a turning point. Expansion slowed, cultivation stopped spreading, and land began to fall out of use. From the 1320s onward, records increasingly mention fields left untilled, soil described as poor or exhausted, holdings standing empty, and tenants giving up because they could no longer cope. By the early 1340-50s, some villages were already in serious trouble. Reports from parts of the Cotswolds and neighboring districts describe hundreds of acres lying unused, tenants weakened by poverty, and people leaving their homes. Many of these places later became deserted villages. What matters is where this early decline appeared. It was not concentrated on newly cleared land or poor soils. Instead, it affected long-established farming areas with average land quality. In some cases, the problem seems to have been over-intensive grain production combined with too few animals to maintain fertility. Heavy demands in rent and taxation also drained resources from already fragile households. After the plague of the late 1340s, evidence for desertion becomes much clearer. Disease alone rarely wiped out entire villages, but it weakened communities and encouraged migration. Where settlements were already struggling, the loss of people could be decisive. Some places that vanished in the years after the plague had shown signs of decline, well before it struck. The epidemic often acted as a final push rather than the original cause. From the 1370s onward, many villages in the Cotswolds and river valleys were partly or wholly abandoned. In some places, most tenants had gone within a few decades. In others, empty holdings were taken over for pasture, showing that landlords accepted that the loss was permanent. Sometimes land was reoccupied by people living elsewhere, which further weakened local community life. By the early 15th century, some villages had been reduced to only a handful of households, while much of their former farmland had been enclosed and turned to grazing. Many settlements survived this period, but at a much smaller scale. Others declined beyond recovery. In some cases, deserted house sites were absorbed into pasture within a generation, leaving traces that can still be seen today. What emerges from all this is not a sudden collapse caused by a single force, but a long process. Village desertion in England was shaped by deep-rooted economic and social changes that began well before enclosure and continued long after the first shocks of famine and disease. Many villages that eventually vanished did not disappear overnight. Instead, they passed through a long period of slow decline that stretched well into the 15th century. Even quite late, most of these places still contained people who paid taxes, which shows that life continued for generations after the first signs of trouble. In some settlements, the population barely changed for decades, only to fall away sharply later. Others lost households gradually, one by one, until almost nothing remained. In several cases, the pattern is clear. Villages that once supported a healthy number of households slowly lost tenants across the 14th and 15th centuries. A place might hold roughly the same number of families before and after the Great Plague, yet steadily shrink in the following decades. By the mid-15th century, only a handful of residents might remain, and by the early 16th century, perhaps only one or two. Elsewhere, land that once produced grain lost value over time, rents fell, and eventually arable farming ceased altogether. When this happened, former fields were leased out as pasture, marking the end of the village as a farming community. New examples reinforce this picture. Some villages show a sharp fall in tenant numbers between the late 14th and mid-15th centuries. In others, many separate holdings were gradually concentrated into the hands of just a few families, sometimes closely related, raising doubts about whether the land was still worked as distinct farms at all. In a number of cases, population figures suggest decline decades before the village finally disappeared. Even where records hint at stability for a time, closer inspection often reveals that tenants were absent, holdings were merged, or land was no longer worked in the traditional way. Archaeological evidence supports this long, uneven process. At some well-studied sites, houses were abandoned at different moments over the course of a century or more. This staggered pattern fits what the documents suggest. Villages did not collapse in a single event, but eroded slowly as people left, buildings decayed, and fields fell out of use. It is important to stress this gradual loss because it has often been overlooked. In some villages that were deserted later, surviving records from the middle of the 15th century do not immediately give the impression of deep crisis. Yet when these are weighed against the many clear examples of long-term decline, it becomes evident that they were exceptions rather than the rule. The final phase of desertion, in the later 15th century, is much better documented. By then, the disappearance of villages had begun to attract attention and provoke criticism. Educated observers increasingly saw rural decay as a social problem. Some blamed greed, enclosure, and the conversion of farmland into pasture. Lists were drawn up of ruined villages, and angry voices accused powerful landowners of driving people from their homes. These critics were not inventing the problem. In some cases, independent evidence confirms that landowners did indeed turn arable fields into pasture and removed tenants. Disputes survive in which villagers resisted such changes, and records show sudden endings to cultivation that suggest decisive action rather than gradual decay. In a few places, tenants were explicitly described as having been expelled. Yet, when we look more closely, even these cases often reveal earlier weakness. Villages that suffered late expulsions were frequently already reduced in size, with empty holdings and declining populations. What happened in the late 15th century was often not the beginning of desertion, but its final stage. The official investigations of enclosure at the start of the 16th century reinforce this view. These inquiries record many ruined houses and displaced tenants, but large-scale removals were actually rare. Where dramatic expulsions did occur, they usually affected villages that had once been much larger and had already lost much of their population long before. The language of these reports is also revealing. They often state that houses were allowed to fall into ruin and that tenants withdrew, rather than describing a single act of destruction. This suggests abandonment through neglect and opportunity rather than sudden force. Some accused landowners defended themselves by arguing that decline had set in long before they took action. They claimed that arable land had become hard to let, that tenants were scarce, and that pasture was in greater demand. While such arguments served their interests, they align with evidence from other estates showing a persistent shortage of tenants even at the end of the 15th century. This is reinforced by the many efforts made by landowners to prevent villages from collapsing. Throughout the late 14th and 15th centuries, there are repeated attempts to stop tenants from leaving and to keep holdings occupied. Sometimes pressure was applied to force people to take over abandoned land. More commonly, orders were issued for absent tenants to return, though these were often ignored as mobility increased. Landowners also tried to preserve the physical fabric of villages. Empty or damaged houses were inspected, and the cost of repairs was calculated. Financial help or building materials were sometimes provided to encourage maintenance. Tenants were ordered to repair their homes, and heavy penalties could be imposed on those who refused. In some places, new tenants were required to carry out repairs as a condition of taking over land, and occasionally buildings were rebuilt at the lord's expense. In certain villages, these measures were pursued with remarkable persistence. Repeated fines, threats of forfeiture, inspections, and even penalties imposed on guarantors all point to determined efforts to keep settlements alive. Over time, however, these strategies weakened. By the later 15th century, detailed interventions gave way to general orders backed by small fines, suggesting that authorities were losing both leverage and hope. Landowners watched their rental income closely. They gave up as little as they could, yet many also learned that an unbending approach could backfire. By the 1430s, administrators on major estates were already warning that pushing too hard would empty the countryside because tenants would simply leave. In some places, when vacancies rose and remaining households threatened to go, rents were cut to keep people in place. Over the 15th century, payments in struggling villages could drop dramatically, and the extra charges normally demanded when a tenant took over a holding were sometimes removed entirely. Meanwhile, in more stable settlements, tenants might still be paying far higher annual sums and additional fees. These patterns, together with efforts to control migration and repair houses, point to a simple reality. Many landlords did not want to lose their tenants. That matters because the idea of widespread, deliberate clearance assumes a level of bold, business-minded risk-taking that does not fit what is known about late medieval landlords. Decisions were often slow, cautious, and delayed. Even where vacant land was eventually converted to pasture, the process might take decades. If any group was likely to act quickly, it would be the smaller landowning class, because they supervised their estates more directly and had fewer resources to waste. In some cases, such owners did remove remaining tenants and reshape the land into enclosed pasture. But deserted villages are not concentrated only on such estates. They appear under every kind of lordship, including large noble and church estates known for conservative habits. This makes it hard to explain the scale of desertion as merely the product of one social group's greed. Another force could be just as important: the people who leased and ran the lord's home farm. These tenants, powerful yet often hidden in the records, could push settlement into crisis. In one well-documented case, a local priest warned an absentee lord that the community was collapsing fast, buildings were falling, and what had been lost could not easily be rebuilt. The priest blamed the farm manager for driving people away and argued that supporting a whole community mattered more than enriching a single man. Complaints from the same period accused the manager of removing small tenants from plots they had long used and even destroying grassland that helped the village survive. Court records from those years confirm the wider picture: empty holdings, ruined buildings, and visible decay. Eventually, the leasing arrangement changed, and villagers took over the lease collectively. The settlement survived, suggesting that the earlier management style had been a real threat. Because this kind of evidence is rare, it is possible that similar actions by farm managers helped undermine other villages as well, even when the trail is harder to follow. What happened to village land after people left also shows how varied the process was. If desertion were usually a simple plan to remove tenants and immediately create profitable pasture, Most abandoned land would quickly become an efficient grazing unit under the Lord's control. Sometimes that did happen, but often it did not. In some places, the fields slipped into a semi-waste state for years, producing only trivial rents and likely being used informally by neighboring communities. Elsewhere, desertion created disputes about who had the right to graze animals on the old village land. When a settlement vanished, customs and boundaries became unclear, and different lords or neighboring communities could argue over what had once been routine. Often, the main beneficiaries were not landlords at all. Land could be absorbed by tenants from nearby settlements, or a small number of remaining residents could accumulate enormous holdings as neighbors departed. Very large farms emerged, far beyond what was normal earlier. Yet this raises a practical question. How were such holdings worked when labor was scarce? In some cases, a shift to pasture would be expected, but evidence suggests that grain production sometimes continued, at least to a meaningful degree. This hints that some big holdings were underused or simply not attractive enough to draw new occupants. In one case, when a dominant tenant died, no one stepped forward to take over the massive holding. Yet it is also possible that certain large tenants were highly effective, and that their expansion, especially if focused on livestock, pushed out the smaller neighbors who could not compete. The same damage could occur when land was gathered up by people who did not live locally, draining the settlement of everyday life and responsibility. Eventually, once capital and organization were available, deserted village land could be reshaped into a strong, market-oriented unit. Some landowners took full advantage of the opportunity by consolidating control and using the land as a center for large-scale livestock production. These operations could be extremely profitable because they required very few workers, produced goods for both household use and sale, and turned abandoned fields into valuable assets. In many other cases, landowners did not manage the new pasture directly, but leased it to energetic operators, including local gentry and professional graziers who treated these sites as business ventures. The rents paid for such reorganized land could far exceed what the declining village had produced in its final decades, and enclosure could multiply the value even further. In this way, abandoned villages sometimes became the foundation of a new style of commercial farming that looks surprisingly modern in its logic. To understand why villages disappeared, we also have to look inside village society itself. Every settlement faced hardship in the later Middle Ages, but the villages that died experienced these pressures more sharply. Population decline lasted for generations, and recovery was slow. Most communities lost a large share of their people, yet a minority shrank far more than average. Plague alone does not explain the differences. Whole villages were rarely wiped out in a single outbreak, and later epidemics usually killed a limited proportion of the population. The decisive force was movement. People were already mobile before the Great Plague, but movement intensified later, especially after 1400, as controls weakened and opportunities widened. Even stable villages saw constant turnover across decades. In the places heading toward desertion, this turnover was extreme. Family names vanished, holdings changed hands rapidly, and inheritance became less common. Many transfers ended with land slipping back into the Lord's control, which suggests a transient population that did not settle long enough to build continuity. Migration patterns were not random. They tended to favor districts with more flexible land use and broader economic options. Woodland and valley settlements often combined crops, grazing, and small industries, and their systems could absorb change more easily. The villages most at risk were those dependent on extensive open-field grain farming. These communities had built their prosperity on strict communal regulation of large arable areas. When demand for grain weakened, households shifted toward mixed farming with more livestock. In landscapes already shaped by enclosed plots and varied land use, this adjustment was easier. In fully open field zones, the shift created friction. Converting strips to pasture, fencing pieces of land, and increasing herd sizes strained the rules that made communal farming work. Court records repeatedly show boundary disputes, land grabs, neglected markers, and frequent offenses against customary practice. In some of the most vulnerable villages, these pressures appear especially intense. Individuals began to appropriate neighbors' land, and others enclosed large blocks of field strips. At the same time, expanding livestock herds threatened the shared grazing resources. Across the region, disputes often involved moderate numbers of animals, but in at least one serious case, an enormous flock was said to be grazing on village pasture, a level that could destabilize an already weakened community. Still, these problems existed widely, and many villages survived. So why did some collapse completely? There is little support for the idea that they were doomed by poor soils or extreme climate. Most were on average land that had been farmed for centuries. Their vulnerability seems to lie elsewhere. Many were small even in their best years, and many were secondary settlements rather than the main village of a parish. Small size and low status could make a settlement less attractive to newcomers and less resilient once decline began. A shrinking village could quickly lose the social balance it needed to function, especially the relationship between larger tenants and the smallholders they relied on for labor. As numbers fell, basic services of village life could disappear. Even the end of local ale selling can be read as both a sign of decline and a force that made the place less livable. Another factor was proximity. Many deserted villages lay extremely close to other settlements, making it easy for people to relocate without moving far. In areas where villages had been densely packed in the 13th century, desertion can be seen as a thinning of an overstocked landscape. Legal and economic structures also mattered. In many cases, these vulnerable villages had a heavy burden of customary obligations, which made them less appealing than places with freer tenure. They were also overwhelmingly agricultural. Settlements with strong craft or industrial activity rarely vanish in the same way, suggesting that diverse income streams provided resilience. No single feature fully explains why one village died while another survived. It is best understood as a form of uneven pressure and selective collapse. Weaknesses such as small size, low status, heavy obligations, and dependence on open-field grain farming made some places more fragile. Then chance could decide the outcome. The presence of a ruthless landowner, an aggressive farm manager, or a dominant tenant expanding livestock could push a struggling community past the point of recovery. Although these conclusions come from one region, there are signs that similar patterns existed elsewhere. Excavations in other parts of England often reveal a final phase of occupation that ends early, or a slow abandonment stretching across many decades. To confirm the wider picture, more detailed research is needed across the country, combining documents with archaeology. Yet the forces identified here were widespread. Long population decline, rising mobility, tensions in open-field systems as pasture expanded, strain within village society, and the weakening of old forms of control. It is therefore likely that many other regions would show the same mixture of slow decay and occasional deliberate acceleration. Modern England still carries the imprint of two very different ways of living in the countryside. In some regions, people clustered together in compact villages. In others, homes were spread across the landscape as hamlets, farmsteads, or isolated dwellings. This contrast did not emerge recently. It began to take shape many centuries ago and was already well established by the later Middle Ages. The dividing line between these patterns runs broadly through the center of the country, stretching from the north toward the south. Yet it was never a rigid boundary. Even in areas dominated by villages, scattered farms existed, while in regions of dispersed settlement, compact villages could still be found. What mattered was not absolute separation, but which form dominated a given landscape. These settlement patterns were closely tied to how land was worked. In village-based regions, farming revolved around large shared fields, cultivated according to agreed routines. In areas of dispersed settlement, land was more often enclosed, irregular in shape, and managed by individual households. Over time, these differences shaped two contrasting rural landscapes. One appeared orderly and planned, the other ancient and layered, preserving boundaries and roots that reached deep into the past. At their height, medieval villages depended heavily on large-scale grain production. Life was organized around cooperation, shared rules, and collective discipline. By contrast, dispersed settlements supported a broader range of economic activities. In some places, crops were grown intensively. In others, livestock dominated, especially in upland and wooded districts. Flexibility, rather than uniformity, was their defining feature. For a long time, historians focused almost entirely on villages, yet dispersed settlements deserve equal attention. They covered a large part of the country, and in some periods they housed a significant share of the population. Before the 9th century, most people lived in small, scattered communities. Studying areas that resisted village formation helps explain why nucleated villages emerged elsewhere. Any settlement pattern raises the same basic questions. What forms did it take? When did it begin? How did it change over time? And why did it exist in the first place? Villages have been examined in detail. Their layouts show both order and complexity. Some were arranged neatly along streets or greens. Others grew from the merging of several smaller centers. Evidence increasingly suggests that many villages formed between the 9th and 12th centuries, though the pace and timing varied widely from region to region. Once established, villages did not remain static. Some expanded, others merged or split apart. From the 14th century onward, many began to shrink, and a notable number vanished altogether. Why this happened has long been debated. Some explanations place responsibility on landowners. Others emphasize population pressure and environmental limits. Neither view fully explains the pattern on its own. What is clear is that village communities played an active role in managing their land and shaping their own settlements. When attention turns to dispersed settlement, the picture becomes less certain. These communities appeared in many forms, from strings of houses along lanes to small clusters or lone farms in upland areas. Their origins were once attributed entirely to medieval expansion into new land. That view no longer holds. Archaeology now shows that scattered farms and hamlets existed long before, in prehistoric and Roman times, and continued into the early medieval period. Early settlements were highly unstable. Sites shifted, forms changed, and some places disappeared altogether. In later centuries, contraction affected dispersed settlements as well. Some hamlets vanished, Others shrank to a single farm. Yet even during periods of overall decline, new isolated dwellings continued to appear. Older explanations that linked dispersed settlement to ethnic survival or cultural difference have been abandoned. These communities were not confined to one group or region. Instead, their character was shaped by land use. Enclosed fields and mixed farming allowed greater individual choice. Pastoral activity often played a larger role than in village systems. Social structures also differed. Freeholders were more common, inheritance practices were more varied, and populations tended to be more diverse in occupation and status. Despite their reputation for independence, dispersed settlements were not lawless or isolated. They shared the same obligations as villages. Taxes had to be raised, courts had to be attended, churches had to be maintained. Commons still required regulation, even if rules were looser than in open field systems. To understand these landscapes fully, detailed local studies are essential. One such place is Penduck, a small parish in southwestern England that offers a rare opportunity to trace settlement history across many centuries. Penduck is unremarkable at first glance. It was not a major estate center, not close to a town, and its land is of average quality. Yet this ordinariness makes it valuable. Its size allows close study. Its fields preserve traces of past activity. Its records, though incomplete, can be supplemented by those of neighboring areas. The land itself tells the first part of the story. Penduck lies on gently rising ground near former wetlands. Streams flow away toward larger rivers. A natural pool once formed a local landmark. The soils are workable but unexceptional. Differences between east and west appear to reflect management rather than natural advantage. Roads passed through the parish from early times. Some followed routes that may stretch back to Roman usage. Woodlands once covered much of the surrounding region, and Penduck lay close to a forest reserved for elite hunting in the medieval period. Although this area was long thought to have been settled only in the early Middle Ages, physical evidence suggests a deeper past. Scattered stone tools hint at prehistoric activity. Burial mounds mentioned in early boundary descriptions point to ancient ritual landscapes. Nearby hilltops served as centers of power in the Iron Age. Roman material is widespread across the parish. Pottery appears in nearly every plowed field, indicating small farms or hamlets spread across the landscape. These were modest communities, but they were connected to wider markets. The density and spread of this material suggest that land was intensively used and has supported a significant population. After the Roman period, material evidence becomes scarcer. Production systems changed, and woodland expanded. By the time of the late 11th century, much of the land recorded as farmland in Roman times had reverted to forest. Fields that once produced crops were later cleared again during medieval expansion. The place name itself reflects this long continuity. It refers to a cultivated landscape shaped by people who spoke a different language but worked the same land. A low ridge overlooking the marshes became the focal point of later settlement and remained under cultivation for centuries. Penduck's history reveals a pattern repeated across much of England. Periods of growth were followed by retreat. Fields became woodland, then fields again. Settlement expanded, contracted, and reshaped itself over time. The later Middle Ages marked one of these turning points, when population decline and changing priorities altered how land was used and where people lived. In the 10th and 11th centuries, Penduck and the surrounding countryside functioned as woodland extensions of richer agricultural estates located in the Avon Valley. two long belts of forest lay along the lower slopes of the Malvern Hills. One stretched near Welland and Little Malvern, while the other covered Barrow and Pendock. These wooded zones were not isolated. They were administratively connected to cultivated centers many kilometers away, forming a system in which fertile lowland farms relied on distant woods for vital resources. Written records from the period suggest that Pendock was managed as part of a wider network rather than as a self-contained community. Documents copied in the 11th century describe arrangements that linked Pendock to major estates closer to the river systems. Although some of these texts were produced later and cannot be taken at face value for the 9th century, they reveal how land was organized when those records were created. Other surviving notes indicate that Pendock was, at times, supervised from nearby estates, rather than directly from the Avon Valley, suggesting flexible administration rather than fixed ownership. These links between arable lowlands and wooded uplands were not unusual. Across early medieval England, estates were often fragmented across long distances. This pattern encouraged regional specialization. Communities in fertile valleys focused on growing grain, secure in the knowledge that timber, fuel, and grazing could be obtained from outlying woodland zones. Such arrangements were likely a response to the breakdown of long-distance trade after Roman rule ended, rather than a survival from prehistoric land organization. Evidence from Pendock itself points away from the idea of continuous forest cover in Roman times. Archaeological finds show extensive earlier cultivation, implying that woodland expansion occurred later. The system of linking arable estates to remote woods appears to have developed gradually in the early medieval centuries, adapting to new economic realities. By the time of the late 11th century, Pendock was firmly embedded in this structure. The woodland was actively managed. Trees were cut on a rotational basis to provide fuel and construction material, while other areas were used for grazing. A network of tracks connected clearings, pastures, and working areas. One main route led eastward toward the arable heartlands, crossing streams by constructed bridges. Local paths served herders and woodworkers. Boundary descriptions from the 10th century refer to streams, pools, and trees, but also mention hedges, open grazing land, fenced enclosures, and clearings. This was not untouched wilderness. It was a shaped and inhabited landscape. Place names attached to boundary features suggest individual responsibility and tenancy. Bridges, pools, and clearings bore personal names, indicating long-term use and local control. By the later 10th century, Pendock was already moving along a familiar path seen in many woodland dependencies. What had once been a peripheral zone was becoming a settled community in its own right. Permanent occupation did not begin from nothing. In the eastern part of Pendock, small-scale cultivation likely continued uninterrupted from earlier periods. Growth accelerated when land was leased to lay tenants. The earliest known holders appear in records from the late 10th century, followed by a succession of individuals who passed the land by inheritance or grant. Control shifted between ecclesiastical and lay hands, but Pendock itself remained marginal in wealth and population. Records from the late 11th century suggest a very small community. Cultivated land was limited, and much of the area remained woodland or pasture. The workforce consisted largely of unfree laborers and a handful of smallholders. The total population may have numbered only a few dozen people. Supplementary land elsewhere was needed to support the settlement, indicating that Pendock alone could not sustain its inhabitants. Over time, the landscape took on a more complex form. After woodland regeneration in the centuries following Roman rule, Penduc formed part of a larger forested zone that included Barrow. At some point, the two areas were separated. Access to meadowland along nearby streams became a point of negotiation, resulting in a divided parish structure that still reflects medieval compromises. Later records show that Penduc's territory extended beyond its modern boundaries, with scattered parcels of land held in neighboring places. By the 11th century, the main focus of settlement lay in the eastern part of Penduc. Archaeological finds support this. Early medieval pottery clusters around what became the village center, and this was also where the parish church was built. The earliest stonework dates from the 12th century, suggesting that any earlier structure was modest. The manorial center was located nearby, reinforcing the eastern area's role as the heart of the community. Although the western part of Penduc contained extensive woodland, it was not entirely unused. References to plowed land and later evidence of cultivated domain holdings suggest that small-scale farming continued there as well. The division between east and west was therefore one of emphasis rather than absolute function. By the end of the 11th century, Penduc had emerged as a divided but coherent settlement. One part consisted largely of woodland and pasture tied to a larger estate, while the other formed a small lay manor with peasant dwellings and administrative functions. Any permanent inhabitants in the western area were likely foresters, herders, or rent-paying tenants not fully recorded in official surveys. During the 12th and 13th centuries, the character of Penduc changed dramatically. Cultivation expanded into former woodland and pasture. This was not the creation of entirely new farmland, but the reopening of land that had been worked in earlier centuries. Clearance continued for generations, driven in part by pressure on resources and population growth. Documentary evidence from forest courts confirms ongoing expansion into wooded areas well into the 13th century. In the eastern part of the parish, fields pushed steadily outward. Names preserved in later records recall former woodland. In the west, large tracts were cleared and brought under cultivation. At the same time, patterns of ownership became increasingly complex. Several small manorial centers emerged, some associated with religious houses, others with minor gentry families. Moated sites appeared, reflecting rising status and local authority. These developments encouraged further settlement. Peasant households multiplied, and the number of dwellings grew steadily. Documentary sources suggest several dozen households, but this likely underestimates the true figure, as poorer residents and subtenants are often invisible in written records. Physical evidence paints a fuller picture. Earthworks, pottery scatters, surviving buildings, and later housing patterns indicate a much denser medieval occupation. Penduc's medieval landscape reads like a living web of paths and small holdings. Many of the lanes still exist today, and their age is written into the ground itself. In places, the roots sink below the surrounding land, worn down by centuries of feet, hooves, and wheels. Thick, mixed hedgerows often border these sunken tracks, and along them, homes once stood at steady intervals, sometimes only a short walk apart. Where later generations left these places behind, the ground still preserves the footprints of daily life as low platforms, shallow hollows, and faint outlines of yards. One of the most striking routeways runs northward from the church towards the edge of the moor. Today it seems to stop at the church, but in the Middle Ages it continued south beyond the parish line, linking Penduc to neighboring communities. Just north of the church, earthworks cluster tightly, suggesting a high-status focus of settlement. The remains look like two adjacent zones of building platforms and sunken spaces, divided by a narrow track. Farther along, the route crosses areas once plowed in long ridges, then meets an older east-west line where the two paths briefly merge into a curved, deeply worn section. Close by, one house platform survives clearly, while another site has been heavily reduced by later farming but still yields large amounts of medieval pottery. As the track nears the moor, the hollow deepens dramatically. This was a droveway, used to take cattle out to summer grazing when the ground was dry enough to cross safely. Finds from these northern house sites show occupation lasting for centuries, and traces near the church hint that settlement may have taken root here by the 11th century. Sledge Green looks like a small cluster now, but that tight grouping is mostly a later development. In medieval times, it was more of a stretched-out line than a compact hamlet. Evidence on the north side of the road points to one or two early house sites, followed by a strip of former arable land with visible ridge patterns, then a timber-framed house that still stands. Farther west, additional house sites appear as worn earthworks and dense pottery scatters, showing long occupation and later rebuilding. On the south side, documents and pottery spreads indicate more dwellings, and it is likely that some modern houses sit on older plots. Put together, the medieval settlement here was a long ribbon of perhaps 9 or 10 houses extending for close to a kilometer. Its story also shows how slow decline could be. Some eastern house sites were abandoned before 1500, while others survived much longer, with western sites lasting into the 17th century, and later building gradually gathering around the main road. In West Penduck, Grafton Lane offers another clear view of the same kind of settlement. The medieval track runs close to the modern road, but does not always match it exactly, and earthworks suggest that the route shifted over time. Near the eastern end, moated enclosures dominate, including one around the main house. Along the lane lie empty-looking crofts marked by ditches, then a plot with a large rounded platform, suggesting a former dwelling or substantial building. Nearby, more typical house sites appear as rectangular enclosures containing building platforms. Opposite these, additional platforms fill another enclosure where a house stood even in the early 19th century. Along the same stretch, further building platforms appear among patches of ridge-plowed land. Here, around 7 houses once lay spaced out along roughly 800 meters, not in a tight village block, but as a broken chain of homesteads. Moor Court stands apart in a low valley, where plowed ridges once ran across the slopes and wet meadowland stretched toward the moor. A water-filled moat, still noticeable in winter, enclosed the main platform. Channels and overflow cuts guided water away, and earthworks around the site suggest a substantial complex beyond the moat itself. Working yards, farm buildings, and possibly gardens extending for a long distance. Pottery suggests long survival here, reaching well beyond the medieval period. This was not a simple peasant holding. It was the center of a manor that seems to have emerged after the Norman survey period and later belonged to a prominent family. When we step back, Penduck's dominant settlement pattern becomes clear. It was not a compact village square or a tight cluster of streets. Instead, it formed what we might call interrupted rows, houses placed along roads with working land between them. Plots did not usually face each other neatly across the road. Instead, a dwelling might sit with a croft beside it, then a gap of cultivated ground, then another dwelling farther on. Across the parish, 5 such interrupted rows shaped the settlement, and alongside them were a few more isolated sites like Moor Court, positioned where arable met moorland. Several of these rows run beside land that had once been newly cleared, which suggests how the pattern began. Homes appearing along the edge of open grazing land, then cultivation pushing outward as families expanded their use of the landscape. By the 13th century, cultivation had spread across almost the entire parish. Documents describe land under the plough in fields, crofts, and furlongs. On the ground, ridge and furrow survives best in pasture fields that escaped later leveling, and older aerial photographs show that even more once existed. The narrow ridges typical of Worcestershire woodland areas match closely with abandoned house sites, suggesting medieval origins. Pottery scatters across modern plough soil reinforce the picture, marking where manure and household waste were spread over arable. Together, the evidence indicates that, apart from streamside meadows and the wet, marshy zones where ploughing was impossible, almost all of Pendock was farmed at some point during the Middle Ages. Not all of this land was ideal. Some plots later carried names that imply difficult, wet ground, and several areas that were cultivated in the medieval period later reverted to pasture in modern times. Woodland, once dominant, had largely disappeared from Pendock itself by the later Middle Ages. Trees likely remained on steep slopes and along hedges, but the main timber supply came from outside the parish. A small wood in a neighboring parish and a larger detached grove near the Malvern Hills helped meet fuel and building needs. This external dependence is revealing. A place that had once served as woodland support for distant estates had transformed so completely into an arable-focused community that it required its own separate woodland resource to function. Over a long time span, Pendock shows repeated shifts in cultivated area. In the Roman period, evidence suggests extensive settlement and farming across much of the territory. In the early Middle Ages, cultivation shrank and woodland expanded. Then, in the 12th and 13th centuries, the plowed area grew again until it reached a high point around 1300, perhaps matching the extent of Roman-era cultivation. This pattern warns us against assuming that land use was steady everywhere. In woodland regions, long retreats and later renewals could be dramatic. Pendock's farming layout also differed from the textbook image of evenly organized fields. Here, arable was arranged in an irregular set of fields and crofts of varying sizes, and holdings were scattered across them in a way that looks haphazard on paper. A tenant might hold a strip in one field and another strip far away in a different one. Even some crofts were subdivided into strips shared by multiple people, mixing private plots with shared cultivation. Many small crofts sat beside messuages, filling the gaps between houses along the interrupted rows. These crofts could be used as arable or pasture depending on need, giving households flexibility. Some of the largest open areas were not fully enclosed until much later, showing how long mixed arrangements could persist. This kind of landscape demanded careful cooperation, but not always at the level of the whole village. Groups of neighbors sharing a field needed to align rotations and grazing rules, especially when fallow land was opened to animals. At the same time, Pendock's people did not enjoy the simple convenience of having all their land at their doorstep. Although many households had an adjacent croft, other parcels lay scattered across the parish, sometimes even spanning both East and West Pendock. Managing crops and watching animals required constant movement along the lanes, not unlike the daily travel demanded of people in more compact villages whose strips were spread across distant fields. Socially, Pendock combined relative freedom with sharp inequality. Early on, labor depended heavily on unfree workers and a small number of minor tenants. Later, population growth seems to have been fueled by an influx of freer tenants who held land on lower rents. These people cleared new ground or bought newly created plots, and their surnames often reflected where they lived, especially near moor, pool, cleave, or hillside. Some names also became tied to newly cleared lands, fixing family identity to the landscape itself. Those who cleared on a large scale or who used the land market effectively built substantial holdings and became prominent in local life. Their names recur in tax payments, legal witness lists, and jury service. At the other end of the spectrum, many smallholders emerge clearly in later records. Some held only a messuage with a croft, or a couple of acres, paying tiny rents. A small middle group held modest farms, but they were overshadowed by two major holdings focused at manor centers, which between them controlled a large share of the parish's resources. There is also a strong impression that many tenants held land beyond Pendock as well, both wealthy and poor, meaning that a person with little land recorded in Pendock might still have had other resources elsewhere. Even with social inequality, active trade, and a territory split into separate parts, Pendock still needed shared rules to function. Money for royal taxes had to be assessed, gathered, and delivered, and that could only happen if the leading villagers coordinated the process. The church also pulled people together. Wardens had to be chosen, repairs had to be funded, and the building itself had to be kept equipped and cared for. On top of this, the parish could not ignore practical duties that affected everyone, like keeping roads passable and clearing drainage channels. When grazing rights were threatened, people in places like Pendock would also have acted as a group, pushing back against outsiders who tried to take what the community considered its own. Life in wooded districts was not a shelter from late medieval hardship. Nearby Longden shows how multiple disasters could strike at once in the years around 1348 and 1349. Disease carried off a large share of tenants, relentless rain damaged crops and flooded meadows, buildings were lost to fire, and officials demanded supplies under pressure. Yet these shocks sat within a bigger, slower transformation that lasted for generations. Population decline and a gradual shift in farming priorities away from grain and toward grass and livestock. By the early 15th century, Pendock appears in tax records as a place with fewer than 10 households, hinting at a sharp fall from its earlier medieval peak. Later lists show a reduced community that still survived, just at a smaller scale. By the early 16th century, tax payments and family counts suggest a population well under half of what it had been at its height. Over roughly 2 centuries, the number of people living in the parish dropped by more than half, broadly matching what happened across England. This decline left marks in the settlement pattern. Many former house plots became empty tofts, and some holdings were left at risk because a single tenant controlled more than one property, making extra houses unnecessary. Other plots belonged to people who lived elsewhere. On the ground, the evidence of retreat is clear. Abandoned house platforms, sunken yards, and clusters of medieval pottery that concentrate where buildings once stood. The timing was not uniform. One place fell out of use as early as the 14th century, others in the 15th, while at least one site continued long enough to leave later pottery as well, showing occupation lasting beyond 1600. The thinning of settlement did not stop in the medieval period. Even in the last 2 centuries, buildings recorded on early maps disappeared, and a noticeable share of 19th century structures has since vanished. Yet Pendock did not collapse into emptiness. Tenants remained, and farming did not flip entirely from crops to pasture. Some fields stayed in cultivation, even as the community shrank. At the same time, another process gained momentum: consolidation. Separate holdings merged, and older local manors were gradually brought under a single lordship. As control became more unified, older residences and redundant houses lost their purpose. Over time, the parish's main centers shifted toward Moor Court and Prior's Court, while earlier focal points faded. In the modern era, movement within the parish accelerated. Land holdings were consolidated and enclosed, and more people arrived whose livelihoods were not tied directly to farming. Some areas near the medieval church lost residents, while new clusters formed at Sledge Green and at the crossroads near Cromer Lake. By the late 19th century, the balance had shifted so far that a new church was built near the western cluster, and after another century, the medieval church was no longer needed for regular worship. This story also challenges the assumption that dispersed settlement meant disorder. An interrupted row, with houses spaced along lanes and plots of working land between them, could not have appeared without some organizing force. Each new messuage and croft reduced shared grazing space, so existing inhabitants would have had an interest in controlling where new plots could be created. Lords also had a stake, because newcomers were expected to recognize authority and pay rent. Growth along lanes may have happened bit by bit, but it still required decisions, boundaries, and agreement. Looking further back, Pendock's land use began long before the Middle Ages. But that does not mean house sites stayed fixed for centuries. In Pendock, Roman finds rarely match later medieval scatters, and many Roman-era locations lie away from the later house lines, in fields that were plowed in the medieval period. After the Roman centuries, woodland returned over a wide area, and that expansion alone makes uninterrupted continuity unlikely. The lack of early medieval pottery does not prove people vanished, but it suggests that settlement in the centuries after Rome was unstable, with sites shifting and changing form. That pattern is seen elsewhere and would be expected here as well. Most interrupted rows in Pendock were created in the 12th and 13th centuries, but one line of settlement north of the church may be older, perhaps even pre-conquest in origin. That possibility matters because it shows that dispersed settlements were not simply a product of later medieval assorting. Some may have developed earlier, and in some regions there may even have been episodes of reorganization and replanning. Only excavation can settle the question firmly. Dispersed settlements also experienced growth and decay, just like nucleated villages. But the mechanics could be different. Growth could extend along roads without forcing a complete overhaul of farming land. Decline could happen through the loss of individual houses, thinning the row without producing the sudden trauma seen in some nucleated villages. The associated agrarian system could be resilient and adaptable, allowing a community to shrink without breaking apart. Full desertion and complete conversion of fields into pasture was more common in champion regions than in wooded districts, where farming systems were often less unified and therefore less vulnerable to a single shock. Most importantly, dispersed settlement should not be treated as a failed village pattern or as a primitive holdover awaiting proper village formation. It was a durable, successful way of organizing people and land, offering flexibility and choice. At some point, different regions took different paths. They can be seen as separate branches of rural development, rather than one being a flawed version of the other. The hardest question is why the paths diverged. One possibility is that the common ancestor was never truly the same everywhere. Roman-era landscapes beneath later villages in some Champion regions may already have differed from Roman-era landscapes in woodland districts. Industries that depended on wood fuel also hint that some wooded zones may have retained forest resources for a very long time. But even that only pushes the question deeper into earlier centuries. In the Middle Ages, Champion and woodland landscapes did differ in land use. Pendock eventually cleared much of its woodland and expanded arable cultivation, but it did so later than regions where village formation happened earlier. Even after that expansion, Pendock retained moorland grazing and a general flexibility in land use that many Champion communities lacked. Still, it is difficult to argue that soil or geology alone determined settlement form, because similar soils can be found under very different patterns. Nor can population density by itself explain the difference, since woodland areas were not always sparsely settled. Even in the late 11th century, some areas with nucleated villages had population levels comparable to places that later showed dispersed settlement patterns. Ethnicity and simple social labels do not solve the problem either. A British cultural influence in the West does not neatly match settlement boundaries, and weak lordship is not confined to dispersed areas. Powerful lords could rule over woodland landscapes too. The timing also matters. The different settlement forms took shape long after the initial conquest period, making it unlikely that conquest conditions alone dictated the later pattern. For a long time, medieval farming has been studied in great detail, yet everyday eating habits, especially among ordinary people, still remain hard to picture. If diet becomes clearer, social labels stop being abstract. Wage workers, peasants, and the better off can be imagined through what they actually consumed and what that reveals about comfort, hardship, and status. Food also matters for bigger questions. If large parts of the population were underfed in the early 14th century, that could help explain why population growth stalled and why recovery took so long. And once it is known how crops were used, farming itself looks different, because production choices begin to show intention rather than routine. The problem is that evidence for diet is rarely direct. Researchers often have to build the picture from indirect traces: grain given to older villagers who stepped back from work, provisions issued to permanent workers on estates, or the animal bones and plant remains that accumulated as rubbish. These sources are useful, but each tends to illuminate only one corner of the menu, and each comes with uncertainty about what it really represents. One unusually revealing window is the food and drink provided to harvest laborers, because many estate records list these provisions year after year. These entries give a long-running sample of working-class food from the mid-13th through the mid-15th century. That makes harvest diets worth close study. At the same time, harvest workers were not an average slice of the workforce. The harvest season created special conditions, so their rations reflect a moment when employers were willing to feed people better than usual. Even so, harvesters were still wage workers, and the season lasted long enough to matter in real life rather than being a single feast day. On the estates covered in this kind of record, workers often received both money and meals. The harvest team typically combined permanent staff with extra hands hired for the season, along with supervisors and administrative figures. A detailed example from Sedgeford in Norfolk shows how this could look in practice. Dozens of people were fed together, including supervisors and the regular workforce, while additional laborers were taken on for the full harvest period and others for shorter bursts. Food preparation was partly done by dairy workers, but a cook was usually hired to run the kitchen. The job itself was brutal by modern standards. People cut grain with hand tools, tied bundles, loaded carts, hauled harvest back to the estate center, and stacked it. The pace could turn desperate when rain threatened. Later observers described just how exhausting this work was, and medieval imagery captures the same strain in bodies bent under constant effort. Because output during harvest was so high, feeding workers well was not charity. A well-fed crew could work faster and longer, so employers gained directly from generous rations. Harvest was also the peak season for labor competition. Lords, leaseholders, churchmen, and prosperous peasants all needed hands at the same time. Even before the great epidemics, villages tried to stop able-bodied people from slipping away to better offers elsewhere. After the mid-14th century, that competition became fiercer, and workers were often accused in court of demanding higher wages or breaking agreements to chase better terms. Records from these disputes show that harvest pay could rise sharply, and that employers used large bonus sums and additional benefits to keep workers for the full season. This is why harvest diets were better than everyday rations in the many other jobs. Employers had the resources, and they wanted a strong, willing labor force. They also hoped that fair treatment would bring the same workers back year after year. Still, these meals should not be dismissed as irrelevant to ordinary life. Harvest usually ran for weeks, roughly a tenth of the year, and the workforce involved was broad. Permanent servants included both younger people early in their working lives and older householders still employed on estates. Temporary labor drew in smallholders, their relatives, townsmen, craftspeople who paused their usual trades for better harvest pay, and migrants from nearby and distant places. Men and women worked side by side in the fields. Even people above the poorest ranks could appear in the harvest household if they held local offices or supervisory roles. Overall, the harvest crowd ranged from modestly secure villagers to the landless and drifting, giving a wide view of low-status labor. There is also a temptation to think these accounts reflect only unusually generous employers, especially wealthy religious houses. Yet similar feeding patterns appear on estates run by small landowners too, and major landlords watched costs carefully. The same labor market set the expectations for both great and small employers, so meals offered in kind had to stay broadly competitive with what other employers provided. Sedgeford is especially useful because its accounts are long-running and detailed, and because the record keepers were thorough. The documents list cash spending and often record food that came from the estate's own resources as well as purchases. Like all such records, they have weaknesses. Officials could exaggerate costs, and auditors sometimes challenged numbers, leaving corrections and notes. But those checks are also reassuring, because they show that figures were examined rather than copied blindly. The records also miss some items that cost no cash, such as vegetables from gardens, and they do not show how food was divided among ranks. Some meats and special items were probably reserved for supervisors rather than shared equally. Another complication is that the quantities are so large that they likely fed more mouths than the payroll alone suggests. Workers may have shared with helpers, partners, or families, and food could also have been passed out to dependents beyond the harvest household. The setting mattered too. Sedgeford stood in a productive part of northwest Norfolk. Before the great epidemics, the estate sometimes sowed more than 400 acres, later shrinking noticeably. It raised grain crops along with livestock, including dairy cattle, pigs, poultry, and a substantial sheep flock. Each year, large numbers of full-time workers appear in the harvest payments. Across the 13th century, the diet recorded at Sedgeford is dominated by bread and dairy. Bread provided a major share of the energy intake, while cheese made earlier in summer and milk during harvest added a huge second pillar of calories. Brewing grain also appears, suggesting that ale was central to daily life in harvest time. The amounts could have supported either smaller servings of strong ale or larger servings of weaker drink. Given the heat and sweat of harvest labor, it is unlikely that ale alone met thirst, especially if food and drink were shared beyond the listed workers. Milk and water must have played a role alongside ale. Over time, the balance shifts. Early in the 14th century, bread becomes less dominant by value, while ale becomes more prominent. After the mid-14th century, the trend becomes even stronger. Less of the budget goes to bread grain and more to brewing. By the early 15th century, the brewing allowance is large enough to suggest very heavy provision, whether in strong drink or in large volumes of weaker ale. The biggest transformation concerns meat. In the earlier period, meat is a relatively small part of the cost. By the late 14th and 15th centuries, it becomes one of the central elements, rising to a large share of total value. At the same time, dairy becomes less dominant than before, and fish declines later as well. In nutritional terms, the later medieval harvest diet contains fewer calories from bread than it once did, while meat becomes a significant source of energy where it had earlier been marginal. If drink is set aside and only solid food is compared, the change looks even sharper. In the 13th century, bread takes roughly half the spending on food, while meat is only a small fraction. By the early 15th century, bread accounts for a much smaller share and meat for a much larger one. In practical terms, early harvesters received a diet heavily built around bread with only small amounts of meat and some fish. Later harvesters, relative to bread, were receiving far more meat. Not only did the balance change, the quality changed. Early harvest bread was largely made from cheaper grains, with wheat forming only a small part of the total. The best bread was likely kept for supervisors, along with other preferred foods. But by the mid-14th century, wheat and rye expand at the expense of barley, and within a few decades, barley bread vanishes from the harvest allowances. Eventually, wheat becomes dominant. When this shift happened, the daily amount of bread per person appears to drop, suggesting a trade of quantity for quality, and perhaps less sharing outward to helpers than before. A description of holiday bread later in the sequence even hints at a whiter loaf than earlier practice, pointing toward more refined flour. In the 13th century, the meat on the harvest menu was dominated by cured pork. Fresh beef began to appear by the late 1200s, and over the following generations it became increasingly important, until in some years multiple cattle were being killed for the season. During the 14th century, fresh mutton was added as well. By around 1400, the official ration implied almost a pound of meat a day per recorded worker, even if that figure counts only the main cuts. A casual note from the late 1300s shows that nothing was wasted, because the innards were eaten too. Fish, by contrast, relied heavily on preserved supplies, especially salted cod and herring. The steady reduction in the amounts issued later on hints that many workers were not enthusiastic about it. Fresh sea fish is only mentioned once the 15th century is underway, suggesting a slow widening of options rather than a sudden change of taste. The pattern of eating almost certainly followed the familiar rhythm of meat days and fast days, with regular restrictions shaping the week and the calendar. If that routine was observed, it helps explain why fish could sometimes rival meat in earlier decades. When meat was limited on certain days, fish and dairy would have taken its place. Before the mid-14th century, fish could outweigh meat in the accounts, which fits a world where cheese remained a dependable support alongside or instead of meat. After that point, the balance flips. Meat grows while fish shrinks, and cheese becomes a companion to fish rather than a partner to meat. Over the long run, even dairy slips back, squeezed out by heavier meat provision and perhaps by the rising importance of ale as a daily staple. Small clues also reveal how these meals were actually handled. At least one meal a day was eaten at the manor hall, at the Lord's table. A large cloth was bought to cover a table in 1 year, though a single cloth would not have been enough for everyone, so the privilege of a properly laid board may have been concentrated among supervisors. Spending on candles suggests that some cooking or eating happened in darkness, which implies either very early starts, late finishes, or both. The morning meal seems to have been eaten out in the fields because someone was paid specifically to carry food and drink to the workers. Wooden bowls, plates, and spoons were bought for the season, and brewing demanded large containers that had to be maintained. Taken together, this routine helps explain why manor houses were kept even when lords rarely lived in them. Harvest time temporarily turned them into feeding stations for large workforces. So the overall contrast is striking. In the 13th century, harvest meals revolved around coarse bread and cheese, backed by small amounts of cured meat or preserved fish, with ale alongside milk and water. By the 15th century, the same season could mean fine wheat bread, very large quantities of ale, and generous servings of fresh meat on non-fast days. This practice was especially common in Norfolk, but it was not confined there. Comparable evidence appears across a scattered set of manors in several counties, and while local details vary, the broad direction of change looks familiar. The first shared trend is a shift away from diets dominated by grain foods and toward a larger share of what went alongside bread, meat, fish, and dairy. On multiple Norfolk manors, the value share of bread falls sharply over time, while meat rises from a minor element to a large one. On an Oxfordshire estate, the grain-heavy portion also declines while the non-grain portion grows. In another case from Lincolnshire, the leap after the mid-14th century is especially clear, with meat taking a much larger slice of the harvest food budget and the balance moving noticeably away from cereal reliance. A second pattern is the growing importance of brewing. On some southern manors, ale already formed a substantial part of the value of harvest provisions in the late 13th century, but in the following century, it frequently rises to around a third or more. Elsewhere, the increase is present, but less dramatic. A third trend is that within the bread companions themselves, meat expands while dairy retreats. Sometimes the accounts even explain the change openly, noting that fresh meat was being used in place of large cheese and butter issues. Local variation shows up most clearly in the exact foods chosen. In parts of Norfolk, barley and rye dominated bread grain early on, though mixtures of grains appear in the early 1300s. In many regions, the move toward wheat as the main bread grain becomes a major development of the 14th century and is often complete by the 1380s. Some manors adopt wheat more slowly, continuing mixed grain loaves for longer. In other counties, especially in the South, harvest workers were already eating wheat bread in the late 1200s and early 1300s, with only pockets where barley bread remained significant before gradually giving way. Drink could differ too. On some southern manors, cider played a major role before the mid-14th century, sometimes rivaling or even exceeding ale. Later, ale tends to replace it, though cider does not vanish everywhere at once and can reappear intermittently. Meat types also follow regional and chronological paths. In Norfolk, the movement is broadly from bacon toward fresh beef. In Oxfordshire, bacon is prominent in the 1290s, and mutton is added during the 14th century. In Sussex, mutton appears and then becomes standard for a long stretch. In parts of Hampshire, mutton is already important by the 1330s, and later the noticeable innovation is the arrival of fresh beef in larger quantities. Poultry stays a smaller but steady feature, with geese appearing regularly. Their timing fits the seasonal logic of fattening birds after harvest and turning them into a celebratory meal, while better cuts may have been reserved for supervisors. Even with clear improvement in the amount of meat, there are reasons not to imagine luxury dining. Much of the meat came from animals that were old, weak, or otherwise less useful to the manor, and officials were keen to stress that point to anyone checking the accounts. The harvest table was often supplied by culls and worn-out stock rather than prime animals. Workers also ate offal, which again shows a drive to use every part. Fish remained mostly preserved, salted whitefish and herring in different forms. Fresh fish appears in some places later on as an addition rather than a replacement. Alongside these foods, workers were also fed thick pottage, built from oatmeal and sometimes peas or beans. The flavorings are harder to see because garden produce often left little trace in spending records, but occasional notes show vegetables being bought or supplied for the pot. This suggests that vegetables were present but limited in quantity, valued more for taste than as a central part of the diet. Garlic and salt appear here and there, again pointing to seasoning and preservation rather than abundance of fresh produce. Across estates, the eating arrangements look similar. Large shared meals, simple wooden utensils, and occasional small refinements like a linen cloth. In one case, because the workforce was also collecting church dues, meals were split between the manor hall and another communal building. The system was flexible, but the basic pattern remained. Harvest created a temporary household with feeding at its center. The timing of change matters. The sharp population crash of the mid-14th century clearly accelerated dietary improvement, but it did not create the trend from nothing. Signs of change appear earlier, with bread's share already falling and higher quality grains beginning to replace cheaper ones before the first great epidemic. Fresh meat also enters diets in the early 1300s. In that sense, the epidemic intensified forces already in motion rather than launching an entirely new direction. Even after the mid-14th century, transformation was not instant. The full shift toward meat-heavy companions, wheat bread, and expanded brewing worked through the system over decades. The peak of improvement seems to belong more to the 15th century than to the immediate aftermath of the crisis. Looking closely at the meals provided during harvest can tempt us into a simple conclusion: that ordinary working people in the Middle Ages usually ate plentifully, and that everyday diets steadily improved from the mid-13th to the mid-15th century, as meat took a larger place beside bread. But that conclusion does not hold. The harvest season was unusual. We need to place those generous meals against what the same people ate for most of the year, and also against what farming households could provide for themselves from their own land. A first reality check comes from the permanent workers attached to an estate. Many of those who sat down to harvest meals were the same men and women who, outside that short season, lived on far thinner rations. For much of the year, their staple was a grain allowance that stayed lower in quality than what was served during harvest. While harvest bread increasingly came from better grains, the year-round grain issue remained dominated by cheaper kinds. The amount of grain given outside harvest did rise during the turmoil of the 14th century, but even when it increased, it still lagged behind the weekly grain implied by harvest provisions. More importantly, for most of the year, these workers had little means to match the harvest diet in drink and in the foods that went with bread. Their cash earnings, even when they improved over time, were not enough to buy ale, meat, fish, and cheese on anything like harvest scale. Some of them did have small plots or other resources, but the general pattern suggests that their normal diet resembled the steady fare of agricultural wage workers more broadly, heavy on basic grain, with limited extras. The same contrast appears in other regions as well. On some estates, the everyday grain issued to permanent workers was a low-grade mixture, while harvest meals featured noticeably better bread. In the South, too, the gap could remain wide even in the 15th century. Harvest workers might eat well for weeks, while the estate's regular workforce continued to rely on cheaper grains for much of the year. In other words, the harvest table does not describe normal life. It describes a short, highly competitive season when employers had a strong incentive to feed people generously. Nor should we assume that ordinary farming households ate at harvest level either. There is some overlap in the kinds of grain mentioned in rural support agreements, where older villagers were maintained by relatives or successors. Those grain packages can resemble the mix seen in harvest records, and the earlier harvest pattern built around dairy and cured pork fits what many rural households could produce. But the resemblance stops once we consider quantities. It takes an overly rosy view to imagine that small farmers regularly ate as much meat, fish, or dairy as harvest crews did when they were being provisioned by a large estate. The difference is easiest to grasp through the scale of resources being mobilized. In some cases, a few dozen harvest workers had access, for a short time, to the output of a sizable herd and large stores of grain and drink. A typical better-off household with 1 or 2 cows might have tasted some milk in season, but its priority would have been turning as much as possible into stored food to carry the family through winter. Even the more prosperous villagers who hired extra hands at harvest and offered attractive meals would have tightened their belts once the season ended. They needed to. Their income was steadier than that of many harvest migrants, but it was still vulnerable, and the months between autumn and the next summer could be long and uncertain for anyone without secure reserves. Harvest workers also occupied an awkward position in overall security. Their pay and food in August could look impressive, yet many of them did not have guaranteed work for the rest of the year. A household with land could often eat more, simply, but with greater reliability, because some part of its food came from its own production. That advantage mattered most in bad years. Small farmers were often squeezed the hardest when yields were poor. They might not grow enough to feed themselves, and their limited cash could not buy much in the market once prices rose. One useful way to compare diets is to look at the balance between grain-based staples and the foods that accompanied them. After improvements in the 14th century, harvest workers could reach a near-even balance between the two, which places them in a notably better position than the poorest groups in society. Yet even that does not mean their harvest meals represent a typical working diet. It means that for a few weeks, the labor market, the pressure of the season, and the employer's interest combined to lift their standard of eating above the normal. At the same time, harvest diets are not meaningless as evidence for wider change. The direction of movement in those harvest provisions reflects broader shifts among working people. Over time, permanent workers did begin to receive slightly better grain, even if they rarely enjoyed an all-wheat standard. Complaints from late medieval commentators about servants insisting on good ale and well-cooked hot meat suggest that expectations were changing, and that more households were encountering these foods more often than before. The growing emphasis on livestock and grazing in later medieval farming also points toward a wider rise in meat availability, while the spread and organization of brewing suggests that drinking ale became more common and more dependable in everyday life. When we try to rebuild the medieval world, two kinds of evidence often refuse to line up. On the ground, we can still see the physical remains of old pond systems, banks, dams, channels, and carefully shaped basins. On the page, the written trail is thinner, scattered, and often frustratingly quiet. That mismatch has encouraged easy stories to grow in the gaps. Some people imagine village communities digging ponds for everyday meals, with ordinary families eating the fish. Others point to monasteries and assume ponds existed mainly to satisfy strict religious rules about fasting. Another common idea claims inland England needed ponds because sea fish could not travel far. These explanations sound neat, but they do not fit the weight of what the landscape and the costs are really telling us. If we follow the money and the labor, a different picture appears. Building and maintaining a serious pond system was not a casual project. It demanded skilled earthwork, timber structures, controlled water flow, and constant supervision. It also required a supply chain, stocking fish, moving breeding fish across long distances, and managing ponds so they could deliver usable catches when needed. That is a level of investment far beyond what most rural households could afford. Where we do find village ponds, they often make more sense as practical watering places for animals rather than carefully managed fish farms. The large, engineered ponds that dominate the medieval landscape belong overwhelmingly to the people with the resources to build them. So freshwater fish, especially fish raised in ponds, needs to be seen first as part of elite food culture. Ponds regularly cluster around high-status sites, strongholds, moated residences, religious houses, and enclosed parks. The pattern is not accidental. Maintaining fish was one more way the ruling minority supported a lifestyle built on abundance, feeding not only a family, but a whole household of servants, retainers, and guests. In that world, meat and fish were not occasional treats. They were central to what living well meant, and large portions were expected as a matter of status. Religious rules about diet mattered, but not in the simple way people sometimes assume. Fasting rules limited meat on many days of the year. For poorer people, those rules did not always feel like a heavy burden, because meat was already rare in their normal diet. For elite households, however, a meatless day still had to look and feel like a proper meal. Fish solved that problem. It allowed households to keep the table impressive, even when meat was not served. That is why fish mattered so much. It was both food and a performance of rank. It is also important to notice that aristocratic households did not rely on ponds alone. Even inland households were often eating huge quantities of sea fish, brought in through markets and long-distance trade. Freshwater fish could form a smaller share by number, yet still represent serious value because many freshwater species were expensive. In other words, freshwater fish were not simply local substitutes for sea fish. They were often premium items, bought, traded, gifted, and served with care. What kinds of freshwater fish appeared on the table depended heavily on region and supply. Eels were common, along with fish like bream, perch, pike, roach, and tench. In some places, river fish added local variety, trout from clear streams, or other species tied to specific waters. These choices were shaped by ecology, but also by fashion and prestige. Some fish that modern taste might dismiss could still be paid for at high prices in the medieval elite market, simply because they carried the right social meaning. If we imagine a perfectly self-contained medieval estate feeding itself, we miss how dynamic the system became. Late medieval households increasingly depended on transport, markets, and middlemen. Fish could be moved from one property to another to supply a main residence. Ponds and fisheries might be leased out, and the fish then purchased back through the market. Specialist sellers emerged, and major towns became distribution hubs. Even when elites owned productive waters, it often made financial sense to treat fish as a commodity, sell surpluses, buy what was needed, and use cash to manage risk. High prices tell us something else as well. Demand often outpaced supply, especially for large, desirable specimens. Small fish could reach ordinary buyers in some regions, and busy local trade existed in watery landscapes, like the fens. So it would be wrong to say freshwater fish never touched non-elite diets. But the best fish, the largest fish, the fish served to impress, belonged to elite tables. A single fine fish could cost as much as a skilled worker earned in days. That price is not just about calories, it is about status. Freshwater fish also moved through society as gifts. Offering valuable food strengthened alliances and signaled respect. Town leaders could send fish to powerful figures to win favor. Great households could present fish to important guests. On major fast days or high-status celebrations, freshwater fish helped turn a restricted menu into a display of wealth. In kitchens that aimed to impress, fish could be transformed into elaborate dishes, combined with costly flavorings, and presented as something refined, not merely functional. This is where ponds become more than food production. They become symbols. They sat behind boundaries, inside parks, beside defended residences, or within controlled spaces. They reinforced the idea that certain resources were not common property. Poaching was punished not only because it stole food, but because it challenged privilege. When groups attacked parks and ponds, they were not simply grabbing meat or fish, they were striking at a visible marker of social power. Even within elite society, ponds and freshwater fish helped draw lines. Owning a well-stocked pond signaled that someone had arrived. It was the kind of feature that could turn wealth into social credibility. That is why freshwater fish could function like luxury goods in any age, valued not only for taste or nutrition, but for what they said about the person who served them. Today, gardening feels almost like a national habit, and that enthusiasm can make the past look greener and bigger than it really was. When we step back and look at the Middle Ages with a cooler eye, we find something more modest. Gardens and orchards existed almost everywhere, but they rarely sat at the center of the economy. Their real importance was not in making large profits or feeding whole communities by themselves. It was in adding variety, comfort, and a small layer of security to everyday life. One reason medieval gardening is hard to pin down is simple. It left few clear records. People treated a garden as normal, not as a project that required constant bookkeeping. Most of what grew there was used at home, passed to neighbors, or eaten before anyone thought to count it. That kind of household cycle tends to disappear in formal documents, especially when it involves little cash. Even the words in old records can blur what we are looking at. The same place might be called by several different names, and those names could cover a mix of grass, trees, and cultivated plants. A small fenced area near a house might be used for herbs, fruit, a few vegetables, and space for animals, all at once. A word that seems to mean orchard could also include a patch of grass with scattered trees. A word that looks like yard might mean a productive plot, a storage space, a working area, or all of these together. And the products themselves were described just as loosely. A single term could stand for many species, hiding the true diversity. When we measure gardening in medieval terms, the picture stays small. Gardens usually took up only a tiny share of productive land. They brought in little cash compared with the big pillars of the rural economy: grain, wool, meat, and dairy. Very few people worked as full-time gardeners, and internal trade in fruit and vegetables was often too minor to leave much of a paper trail. If we compare it with later centuries, when fruit and vegetables grew into a larger slice of farming output, the medieval share was far lower. Yet small does not mean unimportant. Even a small garden could change daily life. It offered fresh flavors, useful plants, and a space that was both practical and personal. In a world where diets were heavy in bread and porridge, a handful of fresh leaves, onions, leeks, or fruit mattered. The garden could also be a quiet place, and people clearly spent time there for reasons beyond food. For the wealthy, gardens carried another meaning: display. A lord's garden was often protected and separate, attached to a high-status residence, and kept behind strong boundaries. It was a controlled space that signaled privilege. It could be used for leisure, for hosting, and for showing refinement. Some elites followed gardening closely, almost like a pastime. And in the centuries when great estates were managed directly, these gardens could be worked more intensively. Even so, most elite gardens were not huge. Many were just a few acres. Some were larger, especially near major residences, and a few became famous for their scale. Estates with many scattered properties often concentrated serious gardening on selected locations rather than everywhere. That kind of planning allowed them to gather fruit for drink-making in one place, or focus certain crops in specific areas, then distribute the results across the estate's households. In some cases, a productive garden could provide vegetables for resident staff, while also sending selected items to a distant main household. But if we judge elite gardens by profit alone, they often look disappointing. Cash returns were usually small compared with the overall income of a great household. Labor costs could swallow the sales, and some gardens appear to have run at a loss on paper. That does not mean they failed. It means their value often sat in a hidden place: reliable supply, convenience, and household consumption that was never priced like a market transaction. We also see that gardening could be irregular. A garden might be worked intensely for a time, then turned into grass, then revived again later. Parts of gardens were frequently rented out to others, suggesting that many owners preferred a simple rent to the trouble of daily supervision. For peasants, the garden was less about display and more about usefulness. Some records show small, separate garden plots divided among different holders, almost like shared allotments. But most peasant gardening happened right behind the house, in the small enclosed area where everyday life took place. That space had to compete with other needs: buildings, storage, animal pens, and a working yard. In many places, the total home plot was not large, and the garden portion was only part of it. That size difference mattered. Where farmers held smaller fields, the home plot could represent a bigger share of their total resources, making horticulture relatively more important. Where holdings were larger, the home plot was a smaller fraction of the whole. This helps explain why gardening could feel more significant in some regions than others. Local conditions also mattered: soil, climate, access to markets, and the degree to which land was enclosed. Where farming was organized around large open fields, it could be harder to integrate the kind of mixed planting that gardens do best. Where enclosures were more common, gardening fitted more naturally into the landscape. We also find strong local variation from village to village. Some places developed gardening more than their neighbors, often where nearby towns created demand, where rural industry provided extra income, or where conditions were simply favorable. When we look at church income records that list different kinds of produce, garden crops usually appear as a small share of the whole, though certain areas show higher levels, especially where fruit, fiber plants, or other valuable crops were grown. Another window into peasant gardens comes from disputes and agreements. Animals that strayed into a garden could cause real damage, and people took such matters to court, which tells us gardens were defended and valued. Retirement agreements also reveal how strongly people cared about them. Older men and women often insisted on retaining rights to garden use, grass under trees, or fruit from specific trees. That detail shows a garden was not just an add-on. It was a meaningful part of household survival and comfort. In towns, gardening appears early and grows more visible as records improve. Many gardens sat on the edges of towns, where land was available and markets were close. Over time, a clear pattern emerges. The densest clusters of gardens formed in belts around major urban centers. This makes sense. Fresh produce is bulky and perishable, and it pays to grow it close to the buyers. In and around the capital, large elite gardens served a double purpose. They supplied high-status households when the owners visited the city, and they could sell surplus into the strongest market in the country. At the same time, countless smaller gardens in suburbs and nearby villages supported local demand and everyday urban life. Big gardens around the capital set a standard that most provincial towns could not match. Still, some local religious houses maintained impressive plots, and in places like Norwich or York, wealthy families and local landowners also kept town residences with gardens to suit their status. In many large towns, gardening gathered in the outskirts. Some suburbs became known for long runs of cultivated ground, while inside the walls, gardens appeared wherever space allowed. Cities also created unusual pressures. When war threatened, open areas near walls could be seen as dangerous. In at least one case, officials argued that gardens too close to the defenses offered cover to attackers, and even tall fruit trees were treated as a risk because they could help someone climb. Yet gardens also survived in dense urban settings because many properties were deeper than they were wide. The front might hold buildings and workshops, while the back stayed open. And when towns shrank in later centuries, empty gaps appeared where houses had once stood. Those spaces often turned into gardens, sometimes forming clusters in particular corners of the city. Smaller towns could look surprisingly green compared with nearby villages. Records show some places with dozens of gardens, many of them separate plots rather than just a small strip behind a house. A few were large enough to matter, even by the standards of ordinary people. This hints at something important. Towns encouraged gardening, both inside the walls and in the surrounding belt of settlements. Even modest towns developed zones where garden ground gathered, especially along edges where land was easier to spare and produce could be moved quickly into markets. Urban gardening belonged to everyone. Wealthy officials and merchants could afford large pleasure plots, sometimes proudly named as if they were personal retreats. But craftsmen and small traders also kept tiny patches that helped feed a household. Sometimes the value of a garden becomes visible only when something goes wrong, such as animals breaking through poor fencing and ruining crops. Complaints about losses might be exaggerated, but they still reveal that gardens could hold a mix of grains, vegetables, and herbs worth real money. Most gardening was not a full-time job. It was fitted around other work, and its busiest seasons often sat away from the main grain harvest. That made it practical for households to manage without abandoning their primary income. On great estates, the earliest specialist gardeners were often tied to the lord's household duties, but even then, true specialists were rare. Usually the work was done by servants with other jobs, helped by occasional extra hands. In general, it did not require elite skills. People doing this work were often paid like ordinary farm workers, and in many places the cheapest labor was preferred, including women and boys. Gardening also demanded little expensive equipment. The biggest cost was usually the boundary itself: fences, ditches, walls, and gates that protected crops from animals and theft. Tools were simple. One exception was the press used to turn apples into drink, which could require skilled carpentry and a noticeable cost. For large gardens, the real expense was labor. Digging, manuring, weeding, and harvesting took time, and some crops demanded extra work after harvest, especially plants grown for fiber. The range of what people grew could be narrow in many rural plots. Common vegetables tended to be the practical staples that suited the climate and the kitchen. Fruit trees were also typical, and grapes appeared in some places. Yet towns often showed a broader mix. Urban soils were worked more intensively, demand was higher, and gardeners were more likely to experiment with unusual plants. Archaeology also suggests that people were eating and growing more varieties than the written record admits, because documents often used broad labels that hid the details. In theory, gardens should have been highly productive, because small spaces can be worked closely and improved with manure. There are signs that some crops were planted more densely than field crops, and that people knew advanced techniques for improving trees. The high rents sometimes paid for garden ground also suggest that certain plots could be extremely valuable, especially in cities where every yard of land mattered. But there is also a contradiction. Many gardens, even in towns, included large grassy areas. Some famous urban plots were used for grain at times, which tells us that garden did not always mean rows of vegetables from end to end. As wages rose and estate owners became less willing to run everything directly, many large gardens were handed over to tenants. This shift mattered most near the capital. Once gardens were leased out, independent gardeners could sell for themselves. We can picture them bringing fresh produce into busy streets near major churches and markets, offering peas, cherries, vegetables, and whatever else was in season. To pay high rents, these gardeners had to turn steady profits from sales. Part of that business involved seeds and young plants. Urban markets were key places for buying planting materials, including onions and leeks, as well as young trees and hedging plants. Produce itself also moved through towns quickly. There was not much room for many middlemen because garden goods were cheap and perishable. At the higher end, established sellers served wealthy buyers, while street hawkers carried baskets through neighborhoods. This was often harsh work with uncertain earnings, and it suited people with few other options, especially women. In some places, we also find more settled specialist sellers dealing in particular products, but they were still a small part of the overall food trade compared with bread, drink, fish, dairy, and poultry. Understanding prices helps explain why gardening can look invisible in records. Many garden goods cost so little that they did not dominate accounts. Apples and cider could be cheaper than the main staples people bought in bulk. Some items, like onions, could sit closer to grain prices. But the overall picture is that garden produce rarely generated the kind of cash flow that shaped big decisions. If gardeners wanted higher returns, they needed to grow special varieties that the luxury market would pay for. Better fruit, or fresh green peas that arrived at the right moment. Even then, local production often failed to satisfy demand. Imports came in steadily: vegetables, dye plants, fiber crops, and even seeds. This tells us that English gardening was not always efficient enough or large enough to cover what towns and households wanted. Produce arrived from regions where intensive gardening was more developed, and it filled the gaps in supply.